Apple are well known for their show-stopping landing pages. They seem to have reeled them in a bit in recent times, but we're still seeing these really nice scroll-controlled image sequences. And recreating this header sequence isn't actually as challenging as you might be thinking. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking it down into a step-by-step process, and here is the final result. And as you can see, let's just run it again. Got the intro animation, scrolling down, groundbreaking sound, then the video fades in. It's pretty close. Yeah, hope you enjoy it. This has been really fun for me to create, and let's dive into the code. Okay, I have created a AirPods Pro sequence component. The process will be roughly as follows. We need to prepare the image sequence frames, which are typically going to be exported from a 3D design tool such as Blender. And in the case of this, they have a transparent background because they're layered on top of the text. We'll create a canvas and set its dimensions. We'll load the images and draw the first frame immediately. We'll set up a trigger to update the canvas image as the user scrolls. We'll animate it in. We'll do the text transitions, and we'll look at the video fade in as well. What's not covered is the mobile responsiveness, loading images up front. So the loading process could be optimized, and I think Apple might be handling that in some sort of manifest file, or I'm not entirely sure. And finally, there's no error handling, so if something goes wrong, this header won't display. So it's not a kind of complete solution, but it's a good start. So we flick over to the Apple page, and let's try and identify the canvas. Yeah, so you'll see here, this is the canvas, and this is where they're drawing the image frames. What I did was I checked the network tab when the page loads. You can see here we've got all of these different images, and in total there are about 65 different frames. So we grab this URL. We can see this is 04, I think there's a 00. Yeah, and if we go to say 59, see them flying past. So we've got the image sequence frames. We know how we can access those by using this request URL. I'm really heavily leaning on GSAP here, primarily for the scroll trigger functionality. It just makes it a lot easier to work with scroll-based animations. There are, of course, other solutions, and you can even write your own scroll listener if you wish, but I've just found this to be sort of the quickest way to get to a solid result. Let's have a look at the markup. So we've got a header, and this has a 200 view height on it. And the reason it's got a 200 view height is because this will be used as the element in which the scroll is kind of tracked against. If I make this larger, then the scroll will take longer to complete. So now it's at 500. You'll see it's taking a lot longer for this animation to complete, and it kind of breaks the content beneath it. But basically we have a larger element, and inside that we have our canvas. So if I take out this code for now, we just have a canvas inside a header and inside a pin wrapper, and I'll get to the pin wrapper in a bit. In terms of the actual image sequence and playing that on scroll, I've got a setup function here. The frame dimensions are based off of the image dimensions, so I check the size of those images, and Apple are serving up this resolution. I'm using GSAP to set the canvas to this size, and actually I believe this is the same as 1920 1080, just scaled down slightly. Setting the width and height of the canvas, we are grabbing the canvas's context and specifying that the alpha is true, and we need that for the transparency. Then I'm generating an array of image sources, and we're using the index to create the sort of the image name at the end here, and there are 65. That will give us 65 image sources. If you were using your own set of assets, these would probably be in your public folder. Next up, we're loading the images, and the load image function, it is receiving the canvas and the canvas context so that when the first image loads, we can draw it. We'll get to that in a second. Essentially, there's a single promise which has inside it a for loop, and for every image source, we're creating an image, assigning its source. The scale of the image is depending on whether we want to contain it or cover it. But basically, we're setting the width of it. We're loading it, and on image load, if it's the first frame, we're drawing that into the canvas. We're increasing the loaded count, and we're checking if we've loaded all of the images so we know that they're ready. And when they are all ready, then we resolve this promise, which will then let us move past this function here. If there's an image error, then we are retrying up to 3 times and rejecting if it fails more than that. So if there was an issue here, then it would make sense to perhaps just display a static image, but I haven't set that up in this example. So we've looped through all the images, loaded them. We've drawn the first canvas. We've drawn the first frame to the canvas, and that's using this function here, which is clearing it so that we start with blank canvas, and we're just drawing the image in. These are full size, so we don't need to offset them, but you may need to move them on the X or Y, so there's some code here that can do that. So by this point, what we have, if I take the opacity here, we have all the images loaded and we've drawn the first frame. Now what we want to do is we'll animate it in, but I'll skip over that for now. In order to actually change the image as we scroll down, I've created a scroll trigger which uses the header element as its trigger, which is this outer element, which has a 200 view height on it. And we're saying we start at 0 scroll and we end when the bottom of the header reaches 25% from the top of the viewport. So if I put a border on this, that will make it a little easier to visualize. So we start at 0, we go down, and we finish when this reaches 25%, which is there. Now we've got to the end of it. And scroll trigger is really powerful in that you can easily update these sort of parameters and tweak it. You can do a whole plethora of cool things. Every time the scroll updates, or this scroll trigger updates, we can access a progress value, which is a value between 0 and 1. We can then determine what the next frame is based on that. So this will be a number between 0 and 64 or 65, however many frames we've got. We then grab the next image, call that update canvas image function again to draw the new image. And that's that really. So once you have a nice set of images, it's quite straightforward to hook up scrolling through those and handle this sequence display. We've basically loaded the images, set up our canvas, the correct dimensions, and then we've created a scroll trigger to update the image when the scroll progress changes. Next step is the text and also the pin wrapper. So pinning the content so it doesn't scroll off, as you'll see here, although the header element is scrolling, this content inside of it, the canvas, is not scrolling. And that's because I've used another scroll trigger to pin this element. And so I'm basically saying, using the header again, start at top, which could be 0, and end at when the bottom of the header reaches the top of the viewport. So what it's going to do is it's going to pin this. I probably add some spacing, or you can actually see what it does in here. Yeah, so we've got a canvas here, the pin wrapper, which is the element which has been pinned, and then GSAP's inserted this pin spacer. Which is, at this point it's fixed. And then once this exits, it's no longer fixed. So really what it's doing is it's fixing the element inside of our header as the header scrolls, and then it's unfixing it once the header leaves. Next step is the headings. Well, actually the next step is to animate it in. So I really just did this by eye, watching this play, checking the easing of it. It seems like the canvas or the AirPods are faded in first, and then the text comes in afterwards, and they both slide towards the viewer. So what I've in order to do that, I actually set the canvas to opacity 0 to begin with, and that just means that it's ensuring that it's hidden. In the animate in function, so we've loaded the images and now we're ready to animate it in. I'm using a timeline which has a subtle delay, 0.2 second delay, and then I'm targeting, I'm setting the canvas's scale so that it will begin smaller. And then I am animating its opacity first of all, so it fades it in like we saw. And then its scale up to 1 with an in-out ease. And once that's finished, actually, I'm using the timeline parameter here to say that I want to start the H1 animation 0.8 seconds before the canvas one is finished, and it has a duration of 0.8, which means this tween is going to finish at the same time as this one. And it's not exactly the same as the Apple one. I think the Apple ones, it seems a bit softer. The one I've got is a little bit more aggressive, but I think it still works quite nicely. I haven't got the quite right margin on that canvas either. Yeah, so the GSAP timeline animates it in. I won't go into the ins and outs of the timeline. There's some good documentation online. Once that's completed, I've created another timeline which has a scroll trigger attached to it, and this is targeting our H1, which is the main heading, and our H2, which is the groundbreaking sound. And what it's doing is it's saying as the header, again, our kind of key target, or key trigger here, as the bottom of that reaches the top of the viewport, so it's basically completely scrolled, we will scale the H1 to 1.1, and then we will scale it to 1.15 and fade it out. So the keyframes are quite useful here, because if you look closely on the Apple site, as you scroll down, this gets larger before it starts fading out, and then it starts fading out. So we get larger, then we start fading out. So in order to accomplish that, I've used the keyframes method here, which is quite a neat way of doing it. Set an arbitrary duration, which, as you can see, this is scroll controlled because this has a scrub true on it, which means there isn't really a duration as such. There's just a duration in relation to how long the other tweens are. So this is 0.6. This one down here is 0.3, which means that this will take up 60 something percent, and this will take up the other 30% of the total timeline. But in fact, this is actually starting a little earlier. So really, like, the duration is only used here to determine its how long this takes in relation to any other animations in the timeline. So we're making it with the H2, again, keyframes, scaling it to 0.9. I think in the CSS, I actually started it scaled down, and then I scaled it to 0.9 full opacity, and then 1 zero opacity. And this takes up 2/3 of the animation. So we see it coming in, then we see it fading out. Which is what they've done here. So not actually too much code here. One timeline for the heading 1 and the heading 2, which is attached to a scroll trigger to scrub it through the movement of the header through the viewport. And an animation in timeline, which brings the canvas in and the heading in with a bit of easing and timing. Next up, the dancer video. So I grabbed the source from them, from their website, and I've made it sticky, and I think that was how they did it. It's inside a full-size section, and it has opacity 0 on it. It's auto-playing at the moment, auto-playing with muted in the background. So the video is actually underneath this content at the moment. Let's just check the... So we've got a header here and our video here. Basically, I'm just fading in the video as the header scrolls down. So we're using a GSAP 2 operation, targeting the video, setting its opacity to 1, no ease. The no ease is important if you are using a scroll trigger to handle the progress, because if you have an ease on it, it won't match up to the scrolling. It may start too slowly or quickly. That could also be desired, but most of the time you just want to have a linear ease so that the scroll maps onto it. Yeah, so we can see style opacity 0, and then at this point the video starts to fade in. And this was started when the bottom of our header, which is this green outline, reaches 25%. And it moves up to the top. And at that point, the video is then fully faded in. So it happens quite quickly. Happens over the space of that much scroll. And that's basically it. It's not handling resize very well, so that's because the viewport width and viewport height is being passed in, and every time that changes, it's calling this use GSAP function, which is basically like a use effect. It's calling this setup, and there's doing a load of stuff here that it shouldn't be doing every time that changes. So again, just caveat, this is not a kind of production ready implementation. Really, the images should be loaded outside of here, and then the canvas dimensions, these would be set based off of the viewport width and height. And in doing that, when the viewport width and height changes, you're just updating the canvas, but you're not worrying about trying to load the images again, recreating these timelines and things like that. So I would separate those out, and I've got a video coming up in which we're going to be building something similar to this into my demo site, and I will be sharing the code. So make sure you stay tuned for that one, and give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to get notified or find out, get the code for the next one, which is going to look superb because I've got an amazing 3D artist producing this image sequence. And just finally, that green border's bugging me. Adding something like this to your site just really helps it stand out. It's just, yeah, it's super nice. And as you can see, it wasn't that much code. A lot of the code is on the image loading and the actual timeline, the two timelines that we've got here. But each of them are not particularly complicated. If you've got any questions, please let me know in the comments, and be happy to respond to you there. Peace.